This is Chapter 46 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 46, Publisher to General Grant. Mark Twain was now a successful publisher, but his success thus far was nothing to what lay just ahead. One evening he learned that General Grant, after heavy financial disaster, had begun writing the memoirs which he, Clemens, had urged him to undertake some years before. Next morning he called on the general to learn the particulars. Grant had contributed some articles to the Century War series, and felt in a mood to continue the work. He had discussed with the Century publishers the matter of a book. Clemens suggested that such a book should be sold only by subscription, and prophesied its enormous success. General Grant was less sure. His need of money was very great, and he was anxious to get as much return as possible, but his faith was not large. He was inclined to make no special efforts in the matter of publication. But Mark Twain prevailed. Like his own Colonel Sellers, he talked glowingly and eloquently of millions. He first offered to direct the General to his own former subscription publisher at Hartford, then finally proposed to publish it himself, offering Grant 70% of the net returns and to pay all office expenses out of his own share. Of course, there could be nothing for any publisher in such an arrangement unless the sales were enormous. General Grant realized this, and at first refused to consent. Here was a friend offering to bankrupt himself out of pure philanthropy, a thing he could not permit. But Mark Twain came again and again, and finally persuaded him that purely as business proposition the offer was warranted by the certainty of great sales. So the firm of Charles L. Webster & Company undertook the Grant book, and the old soldier, broken in health and fortune, was liberally provided with means that would enable him to finish his task with his mind at peace. He devoted himself steadily to the work, at first writing by hand, then dictating to a stenographer that Webster & Company provided. His disease, cancer, made fierce ravages, but he fought it out on that line, and wrote the last pages of his memoirs by hand when he could no longer speak aloud. Mark Twain was much with him, and cheered him with anecdotes and news of the advanced sale of his book. In one of his memoranda of that time Clemens wrote, "Today, May 26, talked with General Grant about his and my first great Missouri campaign in 1861. He surprised an empty camp near Florida, Missouri, on Salt River, which I had been occupying a day or two before. How near he came to playing the D with his future publisher." At Mount McGregor, a few weeks before the end, General Grant asked if any estimate could now be made of the sum which his family would obtain from his work, and was deeply comforted by Clemens' prompt reply that more than 100,000 sets had already been sold, the author's share of which would exceed $150,000. Clemens added that the gross return would probably be twice as much more. The last notes came from Grant's hand soon after that, and a few days later, July 23, 1881, his task completed, he died. To Henry Ward Beecher, Clemens wrote, "One day he put his pencil aside and said there was nothing more to do. If I had been there I could have foretold the shock that struck the world 3 days later." In a memorandum estimate made by Mark Twain soon after the canvass for the Grant memoirs had begun, he had prophesied that 300,000 sets of the book would be sold, and that he would pay General Grant in royalties $420,000. This prophecy was more than fulfilled. The first check paid to Mrs. Grant, the largest single royalty check in history, was for $200,000. Later payments brought her royalty return up to nearly $450,000. For once, at least, Mark Twain's business vision had been clear. A fortune had been realized for the Grant family. Even his own share was considerable, for out of that great sale more than $100,000 profit was realized by Webster & Company. End of Chapter 46.